Okay, everyone, welcome to the podcast episode. Today we're going to talk about Indigenous art. Um, Today's guest is Tegan. Do you want us to tell us a bit about yourself to start off?
Sure. My name's Tegan Smallwood. I'm 20 years old. I currently work at Two-Spirited People of the First Nations as their multi-generational program coordinator. Um, so that kind of means that I oversee and develop the community programming and the cultural programming that runs at our agency. Um, I've been working here for almost a year now, but this role is like pretty new to me. Um, Before that, I um, studied at Rosedale Heights, which is like a arts-based high school in Toronto. I studied theater and creative writing mainly, and I'm an Indigenous person. My mom is Blackfoot and Métis from Edmonton, Alberta, but she was adopted when she was like a week old and brought here to Toronto. My dad is from England, also moved to Toronto when he was younger, and me and my siblings have been raised here in these territories. My spirit name is Winter Moon. Yeah.
Yeah, just in case you're curious, I do sort of know about Western Canada a bit, just because I did actually study at University of Saskatchewan for 2 years in
Cool.
Saskatoon. My first year was online due to the pandemic because it was during like when the pandemic was just starting. But the second year, I actually got to be in person on the campus. So
Cool.
yeah, I got a bit of perspective, but not the same. Um, Anyhow, could you maybe describe your connection to your community, heritage, and culture a bit more? Go a bit more in depth on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, like I mentioned, my mom was part of the 60s scoop, so she was raised in like a non-Indigenous family and was very like disconnected from her birth family, her birth land, like her culture, her language. It was like completely severed, which is like not an uncommon story in our community. Like displacement is very common, whether it's the residential schools, intergenerational trauma, or the 60 scoop, or a mix of a variety of things. But when me and my siblings were younger, she kind of started her journey of like personal reconciliation and wanted to learn more about like who she was as an Indigenous woman, what that meant to her, kind of like her whole life. Whenever people would talk about her being Indigenous, it was always in a very negative context. Like it was very much like, oh, like you're native, like you really shouldn't drink, or like you're gonna get pregnant really young. Like it was these really like racist preconceived notions on who she's gonna be as a person based on her being Indigenous. So she felt like it was important to her kind of healing journey to understand what it really meant to be Indigenous. So she kind of exposed us to that as children, and we the like Indigenous community of Toronto was very like welcoming and accepting to us. The like again, like I'm Blackfoot and Métis, so the traditions and the language of like these territories are different than ours, but um, a lot of like Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Cree people were very like welcoming to me and my family, and shared a lot of their traditional ways with us, which I'm like so grateful for. So yeah, I think I kind of you know got to follow with my mom and understand ourselves a bit better. Yeah, I think is that like, yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You mentioned, was it the six scoop
The 60s.
land? 60 scoop. Okay. Just I want to make sure I heard that correctly because I didn't fully understand what that meant. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on what it means? Just because
Yeah,
I'm unaware and I'd
yeah.
like to learn.
For sure, yeah. So the 60 scoop, it kind of refers to a period of time from like, I mean, like the 60s, but up until honestly like the 80s, it was pretty common for, it was very common for Indigenous children and babies to be adopted and placed into non-Indigenous, primarily white adoptive families. Um, there's a lot of like institutional racism, I guess, plays a part in that, where um, a lot of Indigenous parents would be seen as unfit parents based on really like no merit. Like something like they were just much harder on Indigenous parents than like, let's say, white parents, where like, so that like something like their kids would be taken way easier, if that makes sense. And then they would be placed into non-Indigenous homes. Like it was a really common practice. Um, and a lot of like Indigenous child rearing to like the colonial settler mind, I guess was just deemed as like neglectful or like just kind of it just wasn't as common to them. So then they saw that as like this is merit to take your children away. Like things like Indigenous people, like we see children as their own beings, and like it's very child led the parenting. Um, so it's like if the baby doesn't want to have a nap today, like they don't have to have a nap, like things like that, where um, to an outside mind or an outside eye, it could be seen as strange or like quote unquote neglectful, but it really is like it's really based on autonomy and like following the child's lead because they know what's best for their body, things like that. Where anyway, yeah, basically just the notion of it is that Indigenous children were just more they were adopted at like much higher rates than any other um, race of children, and then they were predominantly placed in white homes, and it was also like part of their assimilation process. You know, this was like in and around the time residential schools were not as rampant, like they were still definitely open and it was still um, not uncommon or it was still normal for kids to go to residential school, but this was like an alternative practice so that Indigenous children were still being taken from their families and still not raised in their communities. But it was a bit more like it was a less obvious way of doing it, maybe, than putting them all in like these schools. It was like just a bit more, yeah.
Mhm. So let me know if I cross the line here. I was just more curious. You mentioned your father was English, correct?
Mhm.
Um, so just to help me understand here, is there a way that you were able to reconcile with that? Like having a mixture of both backgrounds? I I myself have British background as well.
Mhm.
So I'm more curious on to in relation to reconciliation, how can those with British backgrounds um, help towards reconciliation, help to acknowledge that past?
Um, I think like it's well, I remember um one of our close like family friends who's um just like a very like a darker Indigenous person basically. He was saying how we were just talking about like mixed race children and like how that is like more and more common in our community, like Afro Indigenous kids or just like white Indigenous kids, like it's pretty common nowadays. And he was saying that from his point of view as like a brown Indigenous person, he was like, it's really interesting and important in a way to have these like lighter skinned Native people because you understand our like point of view, you understand our like trauma and pain, but you are able to be listened to as a white person would be listened to, and you're able to like go into like institutional spaces where we might not be taken as seriously, but you can go in there and like speak our message and um, it unfortunately like my voice will be probably more listened to than like an Afro-Indigenous woman. So I kind of try to lead with that or remember that I have to, as like a white passing Indigenous person, it's kind of my job, at least to myself, to like say the things that my brown or black like Indigenous relatives cannot say or cannot be, not that they can't say it, but I understand my privilege and I understand that my voice is listened to more than those people, sadly. So I try really hard to like have a lot of educational conversations and talk to people who might not fully understand, or talk to white people who might, you know, take my voice more seriously, whatever that looks like. So I think in terms of like a light skinned Indigenous person, that's how I look at my role in the community. For other like just British people, I think it's difficult and maybe awkward, but it's important to like look at your privilege and look at the way that privilege interacts with your life, and you know, whatever intersection you're sitting at, if it's like your gender, your sexuality, your race, your class, your education levels, all those things go into privilege, right? So to really like step back and look at those things, and then I think a really key part of allyship is like listening and just knowing when you, understanding that, being humble enough to understand that sometimes you don't have all the answers, and to prioritize like Indigenous, Black, queer women, like listen to those people who have the lived experience of what you're trying to learn about, I guess, and then taking those voices like seriously when they say like this is a problem for me or this isn't okay, like not just writing people off, right, for like our preconceived notions of whatever they look like. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make sure you're doing okay there.
I'm
I know
good.
it might, I know it might have been a heavy question, but I thought it would be a good question to address.
No, it's a really good question. Again, like I don't mind answering like maybe difficult or awkward questions because that's how we all like learn and understand each other better. And like I think that's like the root of reconciliation is like finding commonalities and being like, we're not that different. Like so I'm good. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. So just to move a bit on to sort of in connection to reconciliation with land acknowledgements, what do they mean to you? Is there a way that they can be made um, better or put more words into action?
Yeah, land acknowledgements are a funny thing. I A lot of them do feel quite like performative, I think is a good word for them. It definitely to me a lot of the time feels like, oh, this is something that I have to say and I just have to get over it and we can get on with like whatever it is we're really doing today. And I've heard some that are actually like really meaningful and like you can tell the person like put thought and time into it and didn't just like Google like what territories am I on. So I appreciate that. Like I have heard good ones. I think it's important, like the ones that I've heard that have been impactful to me is when people acknowledge like the next steps or like the things that they are personally doing to like make amends or to make a better relationship with Indigenous people. I think that's always like a good way of going about it, where it's like it's kind of the idea of like just saying sorry for something is less meaningful than saying like, I'm sorry for, doing X, Y, and Z. I think like, yeah, like actually kind of taking some responsibility and accountability. And like maybe it sounds like political or I don't know, but like just being honest about what we're talking about here, where it's like, like as a settler, like I have profited off of stolen land, like I have profited off of like the genocide of indigenous people. Like I think people try to be like polite or like beat around the bush, but like this is actually what we're talking about here, right? Like why not just say it? I think it's more valuable when someone's like honest about where they're coming from, and then like, in the future, I hope to like build a stronger relationship where like I'm, on my journey of reconciliation, and I'm doing that by educating myself about like the history of like Toronto, for example, right? So I always like to kind of hear what you're actually doing to step towards reconciliation. And it can, again, like there's no right or wrong way to do that. Like it looks like so many different things, but I just like to hear like that someone is actually involved and they're not just doing this to like be polite, I guess.
I was gonna ask, have you been to like a sports game in Toronto, like Toronto FC, Toronto Blue Jays, or I think even Toronto Maple Leafs?
Yeah.
Um, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it like I've noticed that some of them have started doing land acknowledgements at every game. Um, at least when I went to Toronto FC games this year and Blue Jays games, I noticed that they did it at every game. But I noticed that was just like a repeat every single time. It was the same thing.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? Like, is
Yeah.
that a bit ingenuous, or is that a step in the right direction? Like, I'm curious because I noticed that at the games. I'm like, I'd like to actually get a different perspective on that.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I don't want to say like it's horrible because that's like not like productive. I think it's a step in the right direction is a good way of putting it. Like I think like even like 10 years ago, like not even that long ago, you know, we didn't have that. Like we didn't really like I'm sure a lot of people didn't even know the nations, that are from like the original nation from Toronto, right? So it's good that it's becoming more normalized. It's good that people have, the tip of the iceberg of the understanding, perhaps. Um, I do agree how it just seems a bit like monotonous and like, oh yeah, we have to say this now. I also think it's hilarious in like a really ironic way that they do the land acknowledgement and then usually play the anthem. Um, that's hilarious to me. Because it's like, oh, okay, you really like you're missing the mark. So yeah, there's things where I'm like, oh, you're trying, but like I don't know if you're I don't know if they're like maybe I don't know if they're consulting indigenous people on that. Like, hey, what's the most meaningful way that we can acknowledge your land? And again, every native person is gonna have a different point of view. Like, I'm sure some native person would hear that and be like, that's amazing, that's beautiful. And some people would be critical of it and like that's totally fine. Like there's no again, it's hard because it's like there's a diverse group of people, right? You can't make like a no, someone's gonna be unhappy, someone's gonna be happy, basically. Um, I think it would be nice if they had, different ones, or if the person that was saying, sorry, I think my email's going off. If it was like the person that's doing the land acknowledgement took 30 minutes and wrote their own one, I think that would be great. I think that would be like a nice educational moment for that person. I went to high school in the TDSB and they did the same land acknowledgement every morning, and it felt very performative. People like they didn't even pronounce like the nations correctly. It was just like, let's do this thing and we can get on with our day. Um, so I like wrote my own one and I went to like our vice principal and I was like, can we read this instead? Like it's just like a little bit more substance. I can't like remember exactly what it was, but like it was just a little bit more like, we acknowledge that like Indigenous people took care, like they were the first stewards of this land, like they this land is like spiritually connected to these people, like these are, yeah, like it just kind of acknowledges like we wouldn't have what we have without Indigenous people. Like I think yeah, so I think people can still like do a bit better, I guess.
Yeah. I'll be honest, my current university is Toronto Metropolitan University. So it's like the hotbed of controversy in the recent years. I always still see like the emails that come through my school email saying like formerly Ryerson.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if people are going to be able to fully like move on with the new name or recognize the new name. It may take some time. Um and Yeah, no, it's just interesting. I actually joined the year that the name change actually happened. So like I applied to go to this university in like the April where the name change was happening. So I've never known it as Ryerson. I've always known it as TMU or Toronto Metropolitan University. And I've heard like from others that they say it could have been a different name that they could have chosen rather than a more generic name in a transition. Um, what do you think of that? Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you think that detracts from the fact the name change had to happen?
Like I think I don't know. I'm glad it changed from Ryerson for sure. Um, but yeah, I mean Toronto Metropolitan isn't like I don't know, it's just kind of like yep, we're in the city. I don't like right? Like it's kind of like
Yeah,
a nothing name. um like it would have been cool. I remember hearing, like, I don't know what happened about it. I remember hearing like, oh, we're gonna meet with Indigenous people and rename the university like something in like Anishinaabe or something to do with like Toronto, like as it was, not Toronto, but like Tuckeronto or something, right? Don't know what happened with that. I guess it didn't happen. But and I also know like, oh, it's a funny thing where like I'm sure that name change costs thousands, if not like, maybe millions of dollars to change like all their merch, everything. Like it's an expensive thing to do. So like part of me, like I'm glad the name changed, but part of me is like, could that money have gone to something like more impactful for the community? Like, so I don't know, like it's a tough thing to say. Money's a weird thing too, and we spend money on weird things, I guess.
yeah, no, I just figured it'd be good to get a perspective on that, especially since I'm talking from campus today. So
No, I think
um
I think it showed a good message that they were like pretty quick to change it, all things considered. Like, like people, and like the Indigenous community here said, like that man is a, symbol of like trauma in residential schools. Like this is not okay to like glorify him, and he switched it. Like I think in essence, like that was, I they did good,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I wasn't saying that they didn't do a good job in changing the name. I just heard, and I think I somewhat agree with that they could have picked a better name than just Metropolitan.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
nothing better than that came out of the drawing board.
exactly. It's like we pay what like $700 a class, and they couldn't come up with a better name.
But I mean, yeah, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, so would you describe yourself as an artist then? And if so, like what sort of activities are you engaged in?
Yeah, I guess so. I feel like I have like, I don't know if this is common, but I feel like being an artist is like you have to be like this profound, like dedicated to your work, don't sleep, don't eat person. So like I'm not that, but like I guess I'm an artist, sure. Like I make art. So I am like I took like I studied theater like as like an actor. Um I did playwriting. I wrote like a 30-minute length play was the most like recent piece of work I wrote. And then I kind of constantly write poetry and short stories. I would say that's my most like disciplined work or whatever. And I am like creating kind of like a booklet zine type situation with like my poetry. I post my poetry on like TikTok and do all that stuff as well. Yeah, so I would say like writing and poetry is probably what I'm the most like passionate and like active in. But I do love acting. I dabbled in like photography and ceramics as well. So just kind of yeah, like I think making things that people find either like enjoyment or community or understanding is just a really like beautiful feeling.
I just had an interesting thought here, just for some background. I'm actually currently studying chemistry. So, and we have to make stuff all the time. So it's like, I guess I kind of want to add on to that as an interesting thing, not to detract from what you said, but is chemistry an art then? Because everyone considers it a science, but is it
Mm-hmm.
also an art if it's making
Yeah, well,
stuff?
yeah, no, I like that because it's true where it's like art to me is something that people like bond over and talk about and dissect. So like science, cooking, like culinary arts, even like storytelling, like from an indigenous perspective, like storytelling is like an art to me, or like comedy, like I don't know, all these. There's all these. I feel like when you say I'm an artist, it's like, oh, so you do painting, but it's like I feel like art, being an artist, it sounds really pretentious, but I feel like being an artist is like a way of being or like a way you view the world. So like I don't know, it's like it could be science, it could be cooking, like yeah.
Oh, no, it's just something I thought of. Interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and so then, how do you use that art to raise awareness about issues or topics that are important to you, such as you mentioned earlier, learning more about your background and advocating for those who cannot advocate?
Yeah, I think that's why I really love poetry because especially spoken word poetry because it really did originate from like black folks in New York who um were using that like kind of as a political movement. So I think like you can't I feel like you can't create poetry without it being like a little like political or a little or at least spoken word especially. So like I like to acknowledge that where it's like they derive from black folks using their voices in like an empowering way. But I think that's why I really like poetry because I can use it to like I often write about my identity, my just like lived experience with like mental health struggles, with like feminism, with being indigenous, just really like yeah like lived experience kind of situations where people often feel really isolated and like oh I'm the only one that's ever like thought this or gone through this, but it's like no like it's actually like a really common feeling, it's just a very isolating feeling. So I try to kind of create work like that where like I really like the idea of writing things that people don't even want to say out loud like they've only thought like really like yeah, just that kind of idea I like playing with. As for like playwriting, like I the play that I created was it was called Moon Time, and it was about Indigenous like ceremony around like a woman's first period, because there's a lot of ceremony and like traditions around that. So I wrote it kind of in like a modernized way, just kind of this like coming of age story about this like, you know, like 14-year-old girl getting her first period and what that means. Like, oh, now you're a woman. Like, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be a woman in this day and age? What does it mean to be an Indigenous woman? Like having different relationships, having exposure to drugs, to sex, like all these things that kids have to deal with now. And like I wrote this in high school, so I was very much like still in that, right? So yeah, yeah. I like writing about people that don't often kind of get written about. Like teenage girls, I feel like get a really bad rep, and like they're often like made fun of for what they enjoy and how they like they're just really like critiqued. At least I found when I was a teenage girl. I mean, especially like Indigenous women, media has portrayed them in such a way for so long, in a very like patronizing and sexualizing way. So I really wanted to like write about this specific group of people that just don't get like loving exposure enough.
Yeah. Um, I don't envy the kids nowadays because I'm aware that they have quite the bit to deal with. Um, Especially everything that's happening, even like misinformation,
Yeah.
everything online. Like there's just so much has to be dealt with nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just a bit of a comment. I sometimes think the older generation doesn't appreciate that times have changed,
Yeah.
and that while some of it's equal what they're going through, sometimes it's like seem to forget that youth go through a lot, no matter what generation it's in.
Yeah. 100%. And then yeah, it's like, oh my gosh, just like the hormones, like being a 17-year-old girl is like crazy. Like you just and then you add on like the internet, COVID, like war, poverty, like you just add on all these like intricacies, and it's like, well, yeah, like they're struggling.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier how you proposed a land acknowledgement to your vice principal to be used at your school. I was wondering, how have you advocated for change as a youth leader in your school community and even extracurricular programs?
Yeah, no, I feel like I advocated a lot in high school. My school had a really slim Indigenous population and just a lot of, I mean, art schools are historically like very predominantly white and like upper middle class. Um, so with that population, I guess it was just like the Indigenous education, the Indigenous like understanding was like really missing the mark, in my opinion. So I kind of just explained that, and I was like, you know, I think this is a really actually easy way of doing like a little bit more, making the school like feel a bit safer for Indigenous students, like just showing that um, you as like staff care about your Indigenous students. So I like proposed that to them. Me and one of my Indigenous friends started like a kind of like alliance safe space kind of club for like the Indigenous students that were at my school, um, where we kind of like discussed and focused on like indigeneity in the arts, because that was like, again, kind of glossed over a lot in a lot of my subjects. And then I wrote Moon Time, and my like summative project was Moon Time, where it was like an Indigenous story with like an Indigenous director and playwright, and then I had an entirely Indigenous cast and crew. Um, so it was like Indigenous actors telling the story, because that was like pretty important to me as well. But that was like the first one, the first Indigenous play that ever like was on a stage at my school. And you know that was like 2 years ago. Like so it's pretty yeah. And then I think just like I kind of mentioned in community, like as like a white passing Indigenous person, it's always been important to me to like advocate and kind of like hopefully decrease like misinformation. Like, you know, if I hear something that's wrong, I'll be like, that's not correct at all. Like, let me break it down for you for a second. And I think it's like unfortunate that Indigenous people have to take the labor of that work. But at the same time, as like a white passing Indigenous person, I feel like it's kind of like I just need to do this. Like I don't mind. I think it would be great if like non-Indigenous people took it upon themselves a bit more to do a bit more like education. Like there's so many like amazing like novels and movies and like even like YouTube videos by Indigenous creators. So um yeah.
So this sort of leads into another question of, in your opinion, what are some steps that must be taken to create more inclusive Canada where everyone is treated um, equitably and with respect?
Um I think education is definitely really important to that. Like once we kind of like break down some of the stigmas around Indigenous people, I think it would help us all like move forward in a better way together. I think like definitely access is really important, like access to like better like schools or like even like a lot of like the bursaries that are available for post secondary is really amazing. Just because like again like we're living in a system that does not always value us and like it is there's just so many leaps and bounds and barriers for even like a student to show up to school, right? Like there's just me and my coworker were talking about it. There's just a million things, and honestly, like the root of a lot of it is poverty and just lack of whatever that is, you know. Um, so I think like really like investing in our communities. That's why I really like working in like community programming because I feel like I am doing like a positive thing. Like I'm creating like, you know, a safe place where people can come and like be themselves and learn new learn new like things and just be able to like exist as Indigenous people. But I do think like the real root of it is poverty and that's a really insidious and difficult thing to break like generationally like it really penetrates into your life and yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, I think it was a good answer. I was going to elaborate more on schools because you mentioned that a lot. When I went to University of Saskatchewan, they actually had for all degrees a requirement we had to take one Indigenous course.
Yeah.
And I re I still remember though hearing complaints about it, but not because it was a requirement, but because the courses themselves were lacking content
Mm,
for indigenous content, even though that's what they're designed for. It was lacking indigenous content and that education. And recently, my university has started talks about including an indigenous requirement in our degrees.
mm,
They've started to talks about that, and with my experience of being at University of Saskatchewan, I'm worried that my university will repeat the same mistakes and not listen to Indigenous people, especially with the name change. Like Toronto Metropolitan didn't really have a lot of consultation there with Indigenous people, and now they're supposedly going to have consultation with Indigenous people about an Indigenous requirement for degrees. Yeah, yeah, okay, university.
right.
That sounds about right.
I feel like I hear that a lot in like academia where it's a kind of like a, it just seems like a bit of a mess right now where it's like non-Indigenous people teaching Indigenous studies or having like a, it's just really hard for me to wrap my head around where apparently like a white man with a PhD in Indigenous studies is more valuable than an Indigenous woman. Like that's just like horrifying to me, quite honestly. But again, it's like the pinnacle of like classism, racism, misogyny. Like, so like that doesn't shock me basically. It's very sad, but it doesn't shock me. And like ideally, I would love to see it where like I would love to see some of the barriers around university start to diminish, where someone with lived experience is seen as valuable. Like my job really prioritizes lived experience. It's comparable to a full degree. Like if you we have a lot of harm reduction outreach workers. We have even me, like I didn't go to university, right? Like but I had an interview, I had my cover letter, whatever, about like I grew up in community, I've attended ceremony, I hear my elders, like this is my story. And they saw that as comparable to a degree. Like I know how to run a program, I know what community wants. Like I think that's a really like it's a more holistic and it's a more like achievable way of interacting with Indigenous folks for now at least. Where again, like I said, it's just not most of my Indigenous peers are not in university. They started working right away. They might be parents already. Like it's just such a different experience than the average like 20-year-old or 17-year-old, whatever. Um, where like just sometimes going to university is not a realistic thing. And I feel like it's in some job fields, like obviously if you want to be a doctor, like please go to university, like you know what I mean? But or whatever it may be. But I think a lot of things, it's like, do you really like need a 4-year super expensive degree? Like, I don't know anymore.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you're going to go into chemistry, get your degree. you
Yeah,
kind of,
right?
you
Like,
kind, you kind
sure.
of, you kind of need that. There's some safety stuff you need to
Yeah,
learn in
I can
theory.
appreciate that.
Um, but no, that's actually a really, really excellent point. Because I want to say I'm not comparing the two, but you mentioned intersectionality. What I can speak to is as a neurodivergent person, I always see like disability studies courses, and I'm like, you're kidding me, right? You're having someone who isn't neurodivergent teaching disability studies,
No, it's like,
have a minor in disability studies, and I'm literally neurodivergent here, being like, what? I'm
yeah.
sorry, what?
No, it's yep, where it's like, I'm gonna read a textbook that like just tells me like what I know, what my family went through, what my mom went through. Like I know this history because like I lived this history, right? But I needed to like do a little test to prove it or whatever. It's just like insult. Like, yeah, it's like it's exactly what you said, where it's like, excuse me, like I know what I'm talking about. I am that thing.
And I was going to say, like, times where they teach one certain idea around neurodivergence, where one might disagree with that curriculum because they have a different experience. And it's like, so you literally skip over that experience, but you stick to this mainstream experience, and you're
Yeah.
not neurodivergent, and you're trying to push that agenda forward. And I'm like, pardon?
Yeah.
Excuse me?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I'm not trying to compare to. I just
No,
found
it's like
that to be interesting.
it's a pretty good comparison, I would say. Like I agree with you. It's like that doesn't really work.
That's not how that works. 'Cause I actually remember taking in my first year, I believe it was a sociology course, and I literally read a section on like systemic ableism. And
Yeah.
I was like, are you kidding me? Are you actually kidding me? They're teaching this in a sociology class. And I'm like, excuse me?
Right?
You're you're teaching this. And to my knowledge, I may be wrong. I don't think the professor is neurodivergent. And
Yeah.
I'm like, you're teaching this. Um, and it's sort of like you're not allowing for room for disagreement here. And
Well, that's
like
the yeah. If
you're
I would just I don't know exactly where if I taught a course about something that I am not, I would start like every class would be like, please stop me and correct me. Like I would be like, I would just be embarrassed. Like I couldn't do it, but if I had to basically to like put food on the table, I would be like, please correct me. Like this is like a communal teaching thing, you know? Yeah.
yeah, no, just because when I looked at the textbook and I looked at that section, I just personally, for myself, from my personal experience, found a lot of inaccuracies that didn't describe me. And I was like,
Mhm.
you're sort of brushing that under the rug and like saying, no, 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 that's invalid. This is the only experience. Um,
Yeah, well, that's the tricky thing I find too with like these indigenous studies courses where it's like there's over like 300 different nations of indigenous people across like America and Canada. So when you say indigenous studies, like what are we studying? Are we studying like the history of Toronto, like the lands of like where Toronto sits? Okay, but like it's just a really like you said, it's like so generalized and so like pan-indigenous where it's like yeah, anyway, that's another side note.
yeah, no, absolutely. I was fortunate enough when I did my Indigenous requirement at USask that I got to take an Indigenous history course actually taught by an Indigenous professor. And I was like,
Yay.
that's great. I'm
Yeah,
actually I'm learning about and we learned mainly about Treaty
yeah,
Six First Nations, and that was actually specified from the beginning.
nice.
And that
Here
was
we
sort of
go.
there we go. Finally learning something.
Yeah.
Um so throughout this talk I tried asking questions because I only know about Treaty 6. I don't know about treaties in Toronto, and I don't try and pretend like I know about treaties in Toronto and Ontario. Um, I've tried doing a bit of research because I actually was born in a town that's like 20 to half an hour minutes away from a reserve
Okay,
in northern Ontario.
right.
So I tried doing a bit of research and something I'm going to continue working on.
Mhm.
I'll admit I've been lacking. I'll be honest, I've been lacking. So I'm going to learn more
Nice.
and
Yeah,
commit to that.
nice.
But yeah, I I wouldn't even say I know everything about Treaty Six. I just know what I learned in that course. But I figured it'd be good to mention that because earlier you mentioned that's a step forward, is
Mhm.
admitting those hard truths. So I
Yeah,
thought in the spirit of that, I'd admit those hard truths at the end of this.
yeah, it's true. I mean, it's good to like acknowledge like well again like as an indigenous person there's things that I don't know or don't pretend to know or there's teachings that like yeah again because being indigenous is like different to literally like every single nation and so it's I'll never pretend to know everything nor like do I even like want to know everything like it's impossible so I think it's just good about like yeah like acknowledging like where you call home you know like where you work where you like kind of like profit off of I think it's important to understand like who sacrificed for that really.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for being on this podcast episode today, having this conversation.
Thank you.
And I just want to say to the audience, I hope this was informative. This was great, great episode of learning, of trying to move forward rather than move backwards. And yeah, see you in the next episode, audience. And again, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.